Over 100 million little red wagons have rolled across America, carrying the childhoods of generations. But today, inside the legendary Radio Flyer factory in Chicago, a deafening silence remains. In 2004, the 400-ton steel presses of this colossal manufacturing empire, machines that once roared day and night, were abruptly shut down. Hundreds of skilled machinists quietly cleared out their lockers, leaving legendary streaks of red enamel to dry on the cold floors of the radio steel and manufacturing plant. The heavy steel heart of America's toy industry stopped beating after 80 years of fire. What devastated this proud industrial fortress to the point where they had to sever their own roots to survive? In the early decades of the 20th century, the American Midwest operated as a singular, unprecedented industrial apparatus. At the center of this much-sprawling mechanical ecosystem stood Chicago. It was a metropolis entirely consumed by the logistics of mass production and heavy industry. The geographical positioning of the city, anchoring the Great Lakes and acting as the terminus for a vast continental railway network, dictated its function. It was a terminal where raw materials from the western frontiers, timber, iron ore, and coal, collided with the massive immigrant workforce pouring in from the eastern ports. The environment of the city reflected its singular purpose. The biting winds that swept off Lake Michigan frequently carried the dense soot of 1,000 active smokestacks, settling a fine gray film over the brick tenements and the sprawling rail yards. The atmosphere was perpetually thick with the exhaust of coal-fired locomotives and the ceaseless rhythmic pounding of steel mills operating on the city's south side. In this environment, human labor was viewed not as a craft, but as a quantifiable, expendable fuel required to keep the urban machine running. It was into this relentless industrial geography that Antonio Passin arrived in 1914. He was part of a massive demographic tide, one of millions of Southern and Eastern European immigrants who crossed the Atlantic seeking economic refuge. Passin carried with him the traditional skills of a Venetian cabinet maker, a trade rooted in generational craftsmanship, meticulous handwork, and the careful manipulation of timber. However, the Chicago he encountered had little use for the slow, deliberate pace of traditional artisan woodworking. The city demanded speed, volume, and uniformity. The prevailing economic system rewarded output over artistry. The transition for an immigrant possessing localized, traditional skills into a brutalist industrial economy was a systemic shock. The narrative of the self-made industrialist often obscures the harsh, unyielding mechanics of this initial survival period. For a new arrival without capital, without a grasp of the language, and without established commercial networks, the city offered only the lowest tiers of manual labor. Survival required an immediate and total adaptation to the rhythms of the city. Unable to find a market for high-end cabinetry, Passin was forced into a grueling dual existence. The necessity of generating immediate capital to secure food and shelter required him to navigate the city's commerce during the daylight hours, while his nights were consumed by solitary, exhausting physical labor. He observed the urban landscape, noting the practical needs of the working-class families packed into the dense tenement districts. In an era before the ubiquitous adoption of the personal automobile, and in neighborhoods where carrying heavy loads of groceries, coal, or laundry was a daily necessity, a sturdy wheeled transport was a vital utility. The children's wagon, while ostensibly a toy, frequently served a dual purpose as an essential tool for urban domestic labor. Recognizing this localized demand, Passin began manufacturing wooden wagons. The physical reality of this enterprise was entirely devoid of the romanticized notions of early entrepreneurialism. It was an exercise in sheer physiological endurance and punishing routine. His workspace was a cramped, poorly ventilated rented room that served simultaneously as a lumberyard, a construction floor, and a finishing booth. The manufacturing process was primitive and constrained by the limits of human stamina. Raw, cheap lumber had to be manually hauled to the workspace. Without the aid of automated machinery, every component of the wagon required intense physical exertion. The wood had to be measured, cut, planed, and sanded by hand. The particulate matter from the sawdust hung suspended in the stagnant air of the small room, coating the floor and settling in the lungs. Following the assembly of the wooden carriage, the finishing process introduced another layer of hazard. The wagons were coated in thick, commercial-grade enamel paints and varnishes. In the poorly circulated air of a tenement workshop, the chemical fumes from the solvents were overwhelming. The drying process dictated the pace of production, with wooden bodies stacked hazardously around the small room, waiting for the paint to cure before the heavy steel wheels, purchased from local foundries, and the metal axles could be bolted into place. This was labor performed under the dim, harsh glow of early incandescent bulbs, stretching deep into the early hours of the morning, long after the rest of the city had succumbed to exhaustion. When daylight broke, the manufacturing phase ended, and the distribution phase began. Sleep was a secondary concern, treated as a luxury the economic reality could not afford. The finished wagons were loaded onto the back of the craftsman and hauled out into the unforgiving streets of Chicago. The sales process was immediate, direct, and often grueling. It involved walking miles through the diverse, chaotic neighborhoods, navigating the crowded street markets, and communicating across language barriers to pitch a utilitarian product to families who possessed very little disposable income. The transaction was purely survivalist. Every wagon sold provided the exact measure of capital required to purchase the raw lumber and hardware for the next night's production cycle, with only a marginal fraction remaining to sustain the physical life of the builder. It was a closed economic loop, highly vulnerable to any disruption. A sickness, a sudden increase in the price of steel axles, or a week of severe winter weather that halted foot traffic could entirely collapse this precarious business model. Yet, despite the punishing nature of its creation, the product itself carried a deliberate ideological weight. Passon named his first wooden wagon the Liberty Coaster. The nomenclature was not incidental. It was a calculated reflection of the cultural and economic currents of the time. For the millions of displaced individuals navigating the industrial centers of America, the concept of liberty was not merely an abstract political ideal. It was a tangible, economic destination. It represented the freedom from the rigid class structures of the old world, the freedom from absolute poverty, and the ultimate goal of self-determination. By stenciling the word liberty onto the side of a red wooden wagon, the product was positioned as a small, attainable piece of the broader American promise. It appealed directly to the aspirations of the immigrant working class, offering a durable good that carried a message of upward mobility. Slowly, the direct street sales began to generate a fragile surplus of capital. The Liberty Coaster proved durable, and the localized demand within the Chicago neighborhoods remained steady. The sheer volume of families requiring inexpensive, multi-use transport provided a continuous market. However, the fundamental mechanics of the operation were inherently flawed and possessed a rigid ceiling. The system of manufacturing a product entirely by hand, relying on the physical endurance of a single individual working through the night, could not scale. The mathematics of the business were absolute. A human being can only saw a certain number of planks, turn a certain number of screws, and apply a certain number of coats of paint before physical exhaustion mandates a halt. The production capacity was strictly locked to the limits of biology. Furthermore, wood, as a primary manufacturing material, presented severe logistical limitations. It was inconsistent. It splintered, it warped under the humid Chicago summers, and it rot when exposed to the heavy winter snows. The process of shaping wood into identical, uniform products required a level of time and manual attention that eroded profit margins. As the demand for the Liberty Coaster began to outpace the physiological ability of its creator to build them, the enterprise reached a critical juncture. The traditional methods of the Venetian cabinet maker had successfully secured a foothold in the industrial city, But those same methods were now the primary obstacle to survival in an economy that was rapidly accelerating. The bespoke, handmade era of the wooden wagon was economically unsustainable. The surrounding city was already demonstrating that the future belonged to standardization, to automated machinery, and to the relentless high-speed stamping of cold-rolled steel. The survival of the Liberty Coaster would require the total abandonment of the woodworker's craft and a complete surrender to the brutal efficiency of the industrial machine. The absolute limit of manual production had been reached. By the latter half of the 1920s, the localized success of the wooden Liberty Coaster had trapped its creator in an unsustainable economic paradox. Demand was consistent, yet the capacity to supply it was fundamentally broken. The bespoke nature of woodworking, measuring, cutting, sanding, and assembling each unit by hand, meant that increasing output strictly required a proportional increase in human labor and time. There were no economies of scale to be found in a tenement woodshop. Furthermore, the raw material itself was an industrial liability. Timber was inconsistent. It possessed grain patterns that resisted uniform cutting. It absorbed moisture from the humid Chicago air, and it required a slow chemical curing process for its varnishes that halted production lines entirely. The workspace had become a bottleneck of stacked, drying wood, limiting the physical movement of the workers and creating a constant hazard of fire. The business was surviving, but it was paralyzed by its own traditional methods. To break this paralysis, the gaze of the enterprise had to shift away from the artisan traditions of Europe and look toward the industrial epicenter of the American Midwest, Detroit, Michigan. 300 miles to the east, the Ford Motor Company was actively dismantling the fundamental laws of traditional manufacturing. The implementation of the moving assembly line at the Highland Park and River Rouge plants had proven that complex, heavy machinery could be produced at an unprecedented volume and at a fraction of the traditional cost. This system, soon universally recognized as Fordism, relied on absolute standardization. It demanded interchangeable parts, the division of labor into single, repetitive tasks, and the continuous, mechanized flow of materials. It stripped the worker of their status as a craftsman and repurposed them as a stationary component of a larger moving machine. The observation of this system triggered a radical cognitive shift in Chicago. The decision was made to stop viewing the child's wagon as a piece of miniature handcrafted furniture and to begin treating it as a specialized, mass-produced vehicle. It was an ideological pivot that required the complete abandonment of the Venetian cabinet, making heritage that had birthed the company. To adopt the principles of Fordism, wood had to be eliminated entirely. The material of the future was cold-rolled steel. Steel did not splinter or warp. It was uniform. It could be purchased in massive, identical coils. And most importantly, it could be manipulated with violent, instantaneous force. The transition, however, required a massive infusion of capital and the assumption of catastrophic financial risk. The tools of the woodworker, the lathes, the handsaws, the clamps, were rendered instantly obsolete. In their place, the company required heavy industrial machinery. The acquisition of the first mechanical stamping presses marked the definitive point of no return. This equipment was entirely alien to the small immigrant workforce that had spent the last decade shaping timber. The presses were massive cast iron monoliths, heavily lubricated and inherently dangerous. They required reinforced flooring to bear their weight and specialized electrical infrastructure to power their motors. The installation of these machines fundamentally altered the physical and auditory environment of the operation. The secondary consequence of this industrial upgrade fell heavily on the labor force. The quiet, deliberate scraping of planes against wood was permanently replaced by the deafening, rhythmic detonation of metal striking metal. The climactic shift in the company's trajectory occurred the moment the first steel press was fully engaged. A flat sheet of steel was fed into the lower die. The operator engaged the mechanism, and with a concussive strike that vibrated through the foundation of the building, hundreds of tons of mechanical pressure descended. In a fraction of a second, the flat sheet was crushed into a perfectly formed, seamless steel wagon bed. The machine was retracted, the piece was ejected, and the next sheet was loaded. What had previously taken an experienced woodworker hours of measuring, joining, and sanding was now accomplished in a single violent heartbeat of industrial machinery. The implications were immediate and staggering. The production capacity of the floor multiplied exponentially. The unit cost of each wagon plummeted, allowing the product to be priced aggressively against any competitor still relying on traditional methods. The transition to steel stamping guaranteed that the company would no longer merely survive the industrial era. It was now structurally designed to dominate it. However, the product that emerged from the end of this new assembly line was entirely divorced from its origins. It was heavier, sleeker, and devoid of individual craftsmanship. Every unit was an exact, standardized clone of the one preceding it. The name Liberty Coaster, with its connotations of immigrant struggle and old-world wooden carts, no longer accurately reflected the reality of the business. The company had transformed into a heavy manufacturing entity, and its identity required a modernization that matched the cold efficiency of its new equipment. In the late 1920s, no technology captured the public imagination quite like the radio. It was the invisible miracle of the age, broadcasting news and entertainment instantly across vast distances, entirely bypassing physical barriers. It represented the bleeding edge of modern science. Simultaneously, the concept of flight dominated the cultural zeitgeist. Following the transatlantic achievements of early aviators, the word flyer became synonymous with speed, daring, and the conquest of the physical world. Recognizing the power of this new technological lexicon, the decision was made to completely rebrand the enterprise. The sentimental woodworking operation was officially dissolved. In its place, radio steel and manufacturing was incorporated. The wagon itself was rechristened the Radio Flyer. This nomenclature was a deliberate, strategic positioning. By stamping the words radio and flyer onto the side of a mass-produced steel body, the company severed its ties to the tenement woodshops of its past. It aligned the product with the velocity of the modern era. The new name served as an announcement to the market. This was no longer a rudimentary toy cobbled together by a carpenter. It was a precision-engineered, mass-produced machine manufactured by a steel corporation. This decisive pivot established the foundational operating procedures for the decades to come. The reliance on heavy stamping presses, continuous assembly lines, and aggressive industrial expansion was locked into place. The company had successfully grafted itself onto the booming American manufacturing apparatus, but the relentless logic of this new system demanded constant growth. To feed the massive production capacity of the new steel presses, the small localized workshops of the 1920s would soon prove entirely inadequate. The violent rhythm of the stamping machines dictated that the company must either expand into a sprawling industrial fortress or be crushed under the financial weight of its own mechanical ambitions. The logical consequence of adopting heavy industrial machinery is the absolute requirement for specialized architecture. The mechanical violence of steel stamping cannot be housed in conventional commercial spaces or retrofitted tenement buildings. The tremendous kinetic energy generated by hundreds of tons of descending cast iron requires an environment engineered specifically to absorb it. By the end of the 1920s, the newly rechristened radio steel and manufacturing had outgrown its makeshift physical boundaries. The corporate entity required a permanent, centralized fortress to house its rapidly expanding operations. In 1930, against the backdrop of a paralyzed national economy following the stock market collapse, the company executed an aggressively contrarian expansion. While thousands of American manufacturing firms were shuttering their doors and liquidating their assets, Radio Steel broke ground on a sprawling purpose-built industrial facility at 6515 West Grand Avenue in Chicago. The location was not chosen for its aesthetic appeal, but for its strategic utility. Positioned firmly within the city's dense manufacturing corridors, the site offered immediate access to the vital arterial rail lines that connected the foundries of Gary, Indiana, and the steel mills of the broader Midwest directly to the factory gates. The structure that rose on Grand Avenue was an uncompromising monument to utility. It was a vast expanse of reinforced brick and structural steel, characterized by broad flat roofs and endless rows of industrial grid windows designed to maximize daylight on the factory floor. The most critical engineering feature, however, was invisible from the street. The concrete foundations of the stamping rooms were poured exceptionally deep and heavily reinforced with steel rebar, creating a rigid seismic pad capable of withstanding the relentless, localized earthquakes generated by the continuous operation of the heavy presses. Once the physical shell was completed, the logistics of mass production commenced. The intake bays at the rear of the Grand Avenue facility operated with a ceaseless metabolic regularity. Flatbed trucks and specialized rail cars arrived in a continuous sequence, delivering monolithic coils of cold-rolled steel. These coils, each weighing thousands of pounds, represented the raw caloric intake of the factory. They were unloaded by heavy overhead gantry cranes, moving along ceiling-mounted tracks and staged in massive rows, waiting to be fed into the mechanized, digestive tract of the assembly line. Inside the facility, the atmosphere was entirely disconnected from the natural world. It was a highly controlled, synthetic environment, governed by the laws of thermodynamics and mechanical friction. The sensory experience of the factory floor was instantly overwhelming. The air was perpetually thick, carrying the sharp, acrid bite of atomized machine oil and the heavy scent of burning industrial grease. Beneath this metallic odor was the distinct, suffocating chemical sweetness of commercial enamel paint, baking in massive quantities. The ambient temperature near the curing ovens regularly soared, creating a dense, oppressive heat that clung to the workforce regardless of the season outside. However, the defining characteristic of the Grand Avenue plant, the element that asserted its dominance over the surrounding neighborhood, was the noise. The acoustic environment was a landscape of extreme auditory violence. The localized operations of cutting, grinding, and welding created a constant, chaotic background din. But this was routinely shattered by the primary rhythm of the facility, the main stamping presses. The climactic realization of the company's Fordist vision occurred within the stamping department. Here, the massive steel coils were unspooled and fed into the jaws of mechanical presses standing 2 stories high. The operation of these machines represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the human worker and the product. The operator was no longer a craftsman. They were a biological extension of the machine, tasked solely with ensuring the uninterrupted flow of material. When the operator engaged the safety triggers, the sequence was instantaneous and terrifying in its power. With a concussive detonation that bypassed the ears and registered directly in the chest cavity, 400 tons of mechanical pressure slammed downward. In a fraction of a second, the flat, rigid sheet of cold-rolled steel was violently crushed, stretched, and drawn over a hardened steel die. When the press retracted with a heavy hydraulic sigh, a perfectly formed, seamless wagon bed was ejected. The entire transformation, which previously represented hours of manual labor, was executed in the span of a single heartbeat. This rhythmic concussion, the sequential striking of multiple presses down the line, became the heartbeat of West Grand Avenue. It was an industrial pulse that reverberated through the concrete, traveled through the soil, and could be felt in the floorboards of the surrounding homes. From the stamping floor, the raw steel bodies were hoisted onto a complex network of moving overhead conveyors. This continuous chain system transported the parts through the various stages of finishing without ever requiring them to touch the ground. The steel bodies were carried through chemical degreasing baths to remove the stamping lubricants and then plunged into massive vats of the company's signature red enamel paint. The wet, dripping wagons were then routed directly into the curing tunnels. These were elongated, heavily insulated industrial ovens, where intense regulated heat baked the enamel into a hard, durable, and highly reflective shell. The logistics of this operation required precise synchronization. If the conveyor moved too quickly, the paint would not cure, resulting in a compromised finish. If it moved too slowly, the intense heat would scorch the enamel, destroying the product. As the wagons emerged from the ovens, they were met by the final assembly teams. Here, the division of labor was absolute. One station attached the steel undercarriages. The next secured the heavy rubber-clad wheels. The final station bolted the distinctive black steering handles into place. At the end of the line, a continuous, unbroken river of identical red wagons poured into the shipping department, ready to be boxed and loaded onto the waiting outbound rail cars. This massive, synchronized operation spawned a complex secondary ecosystem outside the factory walls. In the depths of the Great Depression, while unemployment lines stretched for blocks across the rest of the country, the radio flyer plant on Grand Avenue operated as a localized economic engine. It became the primary livelihood for thousands of working-class families in the surrounding Belmont-Craigan neighborhood. The factory dictated the demographic and temporal reality of the community. Local diners, taverns, and boarding houses synchronized their operating hours to the shift changes of the plant. The blare of the factory whistle defined the start and end of the day, signaling the mass migration of men and women in heavy work clothes streaming through the industrial gates. Whole generations of immigrant families, fathers, sons, and eventually daughters, found themselves absorbed into the workforce. The relationship between the corporation and the community was deeply symbiotic, yet inherently unequal. The workers relied entirely on the continuous operation of the stamping presses for their survival, while the company viewed the workforce as a replaceable commodity required to operate the machinery. The Grand Avenue facility was no longer just a building. It had become an autonomous industrial organism. It had successfully centralized its operations, mechanized its labor force, and established a permanent, heavy manufacturing footprint. The company had built its fortress, positioning itself to completely dominate the coming decades of American consumerism. The establishment of the Grand Avenue facility provided radio steel and manufacturing with an industrial capacity that vastly exceeded regional demand. To justify the immense capital expenditure of the new stamping presses, the corporation required a national stage. In 1933, amidst the deepest economic paralysis of the Great Depression, the city of Chicago hosted the A Century of Progress World's Fair. While a quarter of the American workforce remained unemployed and soup lines stretched across urban centers, the Lakeside Exposition was engineered as a glittering projection of future prosperity, emphasizing scientific advancement and industrial might. Radio Steel seized this precise moment of national vulnerability to assert its absolute dominance. The company did not merely rent a display booth. It erected a towering architectural monument. Rising 45 feet above the fairgrounds, the company constructed the Coaster Boy Pavilion. It was a colossal, three-dimensional sculpture of a young boy kneeling in a massive radio flyer wagon. The sheer scale of the structure was designed to overwhelm the observer. It was an audacious display of corporate confidence, projecting an image of unstoppable industrial momentum while the surrounding economy was in ruins. The strategy yielded an unprecedented commercial outcome. The pavilion acted as a massive psychological catalyst, transforming a utilitarian steel cart into a coveted symbol of resilience and optimism. Orders flooded into the Grand Avenue plant from across the continent. The factory floor was pushed to the absolute limits of its mechanical capacity. At the peak of this surge, the assembly line achieved a staggering production velocity, discharging 1,500 finished steel wagons every single day. This metric meant that a completed wagon rolled off the final assembly station every few seconds. To sustain this output, the logistical network feeding the factory operated with terrifying efficiency. Freight trains heavily laden with cold-rolled steel arrived incessantly at the intake bays, while fleets of outbound trucks dispersed the bright red products across the vast American railway grid. The Grand Avenue plant had become an isolated economic anomaly, a roaring engine of profitability, completely insulated from the surrounding economic depression. For the localized workforce, this period of hyperproduction forged a complex reality. The thousands of men and women operating the presses and paint lines were guaranteed steady wages in an era of mass destitution. However, their survival was inextricably bound to the punishing, unyielding rhythm of the machines. The factory floor was a brutal environment of intense heat, toxic chemical fumes, and the concussive, bone-rattling impacts of the 400-ton presses. The workers, covered in industrial lubricants and suffering the gradual erosion of their hearing, were the organic fuel required to mass-produce an object of pure childhood innocence. This stark dichotomy, the grueling physical reality of the manufacturer versus the joyful perception of the consumer, became the defining undercurrent of the enterprise. This relentless trajectory of consumer production, however, was violently interrupted at the end of 1941. With the American entry into the Second World War, the federal government immediately recognized that the outcome of a global conflict would be dictated by heavy industrial logistics. The War Production Board was mobilized to assess and repurpose domestic manufacturing capabilities. The board looked at the sprawling Grand Avenue facility and saw an asset of supreme strategic value. They did not see a toy company. They saw an arsenal of highly efficient, heavy-duty steel stamping presses. The mandate from Washington was absolute. The production of children's wagons was completely halted. The bright red enamel was drained from the massive vats and replaced with muted, olive-drab military paint. The heavy steel dies used to shape the smooth beds of the wagons were unbolted and removed from the floor. In their place, new complex molds were installed. The factory was officially militarized. Radio Steel's new objective was the mass production of the 5-gallon Blitz can, the essential steel fuel container required to sustain mechanized infantry and armored divisions. The rhythm of the factory shifted from commercial enterprise to vital war materiel production. The localized pressure on the workforce intensified dramatically. The shifts were extended, and the factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, driven by federal quotas and the urgent demands of the war effort. The psychological stakes of the labor changed overnight. A defect on the assembly line was no longer a matter of a spoiled toy. It was a potential failure in the supply lines of the Allied forces. Throughout the conflict, the Grand Avenue plant stamped, welded, and painted over 5 million Blitz cans. The deafening roar of the presses on the west side of Chicago directly fueled the advance of American tanks and transport vehicles across the European and Pacific theaters. The factory had proven its ultimate industrial utility, demonstrating that its mechanized systems were powerful enough to serve as an instrument of global war. When the conflict concluded in 1945, the massive military contracts evaporated, and the facility underwent a rapid demobilization. The olive-drab paint was purged, the military dyes were stored, and the factory was meticulously reconfigured for consumer production. However, the America that Radio Steel returned to had been fundamentally altered. The post-war era unleashed a tidal wave of economic prosperity and a massive demographic explosion. The GI Bill and the aggressive development of suburban infrastructure pulled millions of families out of the dense industrial city centers and into sprawling tracts of single-family homes with paved driveways and green lawns. This new sociological landscape was the perfect environment for the company's core product. During the founding years of the 1910s and 20s, the wooden wagon had been a vital tool for survival, used by immigrants to haul coal and groceries through tenement districts. In the 1950s, the red steel wagon was entirely divorced from that grim utility. It became the ultimate accessory of the new American suburban dream. It was the designated vessel for the baby boomer generation, a safe, durable toy designed exclusively for leisure and play. The Radio Flyer wagon achieved a level of cultural saturation that few industrial products ever reach. The company aggressively capitalized on the new medium of television, broadcasting the image of the Little Red Wagon directly into millions of living rooms. It became a ubiquitous prop in Hollywood films, magazine advertisements, and family photographs, functioning as visual shorthand for an idealized, prosperous American childhood. By the end of the 1950s, the Grand Avenue plant had reached the absolute zenith of its influence. It had conquered the economic despair of the Depression, successfully weaponized its infrastructure to survive a world war, and flawlessly aligned itself with the greatest economic expansion in national history. The corporate entity was no longer just a manufacturer. It was the custodian of an American icon. The era represented a flawless synchronization of heavy industrial capacity and consumer culture. However, this golden age also established an impossibly high baseline of success, setting the stage for a prolonged, agonizing confrontation with the changing realities of the late 20th century. By the 1960s, the post-war euphoria that had propelled radio steel and manufacturing to unprecedented heights began to confront the physical and economic limits of its own infrastructure. The sprawling fortress on West Grand Avenue, constructed during the depths of the Depression as a monument to industrial permanence, was now entering its third decade of uninterrupted operation. The surrounding city of Chicago was rapidly evolving, transitioning from a gritty, smoke-filled manufacturing hub into a modernized urban center increasingly focused on commerce, finance, and services. Amidst this civic transformation, the heavy steel stamping plant began to look less like an engine of modern progress and more like an aging industrial monolith out of step with the times. The fundamental flaw in the Fordist model of mass production is its relentless reliance on physical attrition. The spectacular production records of the 1940s and 50s had been achieved by pushing both machinery and human endurance to their absolute thresholds. Now, the bill for that sustained velocity was coming due. The physical plant was showing severe signs of fatigue. The massive 400-ton stamping presses, the very mechanical heart of the operation, had spent 30 years violently crushing cold-rolled steel. This continuous kinetic trauma took an inevitable toll. Metallurgical fatigue began to plague the internal components of the machinery, leading to increasingly frequent breakdowns and costly halts in the assembly line. The deep steel-reinforced concrete foundations, poured in 1930 to absorb the seismic shock of the presses, began to develop structural microfractures. Maintaining this aging, heavy-duty equipment required a specialized, highly paid maintenance crew working around the clock simply to keep the lines moving. The Grand Avenue facility, once a marvel of efficiency, was slowly transforming into a financial black hole of upkeep and repair. Furthermore, the sensory extremes of the factory floor, the deafening noise, the intense heat, and the chemical odors, were no longer merely occupational nuisances. As the workforce aged alongside the machinery, the long-term compounding medical consequences of heavy industrial labor became undeniably apparent. The factory had functioned for decades as a closed ecosystem of localized toxicity. The secondary narrative of the Radio Flyer empire was written in the bodies of its workers. Generations of men and women who had stood on the stamping line for 10, 20, or 30 years were now suffering from profound occupational ailments. The concussive blasts of the steel presses, echoing continuously off the brick and concrete walls, had caused permanent, irreversible hearing loss across broad segments of the labor force. Tinnitus was not an exception. It was the standard condition of the veteran machinist. Beyond the auditory damage, the respiratory toll was equally severe. The air inside the facility was perpetually laced with microscopic metallic dust generated by the cutting and grinding of steel. In the finishing departments, the massive vats of commercial red enamel and the intense heat of the curing ovens released a continuous stream of volatile organic compounds. Decades of inhaling these toxic particulates and chemical solvents manifested in chronic pulmonary conditions, persistent asthma, and systemic respiratory failure. The human cost of the little red wagon was steep, paid incrementally over years of exposure in an environment that prioritized production speed over biological safety. As societal awareness regarding occupational health and workplace safety advanced through the 1960s and 70s, the brutal realities of the Grand Avenue plant could no longer be ignored or dismissed as the standard hazards of the trade. The human toll became a catalyst for systemic friction. Organized labor, representing the thousands of workers whose bodies had fueled the company's golden age, began to assert its power with increasing militancy. The unions recognized the immense profitability of the post-war era and demanded a comprehensive reckoning. The collective bargaining agreements of this period shifted significantly. Labor representatives fought not merely for incremental wage increases, but for comprehensive health care benefits to cover the chronic conditions generated by the factory floor, robust pensions for the permanently disabled, and stricter, more costly safety regulations within the plant. This surge in labor costs collided disastrously with a sudden, violent shift in the macroeconomic landscape. For decades, the radio flyer business model had relied on the predictable, stable cost of domestic American steel. However, the 1970s introduced an era of profound economic instability. The global oil crises triggered rampant inflation, skyrocketing the cost of industrial energy required to run the massive machinery and heat the cavernous enamel-curing ovens. Simultaneously, the domestic steel industry began to falter. Prices for the massive coils of cold-rolled steel, the essential raw material of the wagons, fluctuated wildly and trended sharply upward. The predictable supply chain that had guaranteed the company's profit margins shattered. Radio steel found itself caught in a suffocating economic vice. The climactic realization for the corporate leadership during this era was one of fundamental entrapment. The costs associated with raw materials, industrial energy, and a unionized workforce demanding compensation for decades of physical degradation were all soaring simultaneously. Yet, the company was manufacturing a children's toy. Unlike automobiles or heavy appliances, the retail price of a child's wagon possessed a rigid psychological ceiling in the consumer market. If the company raised the price of the radio flyer to accurately reflect the true cost of its manufacturing, families would simply stop buying it. The company was paralyzed. They could not abandon the Grand Avenue plant, as their entire capital investment and production methodology were bolted to its concrete floors. They could not easily automate the dangerous jobs without replacing the entire aging mechanical infrastructure at a ruinous cost. And they could not suppress the demands of the union without risking a catastrophic strike that would halt production entirely. The mechanical leviathan that had conquered the Great Depression and helped fuel the Allied war machine was now bleeding the company dry. The business model that had built the empire was fundamentally incompatible with the new economic and regulatory realities of the late 20th century. The factory remained open, the presses continued to strike, and the red wagons continued to roll off the line. But the momentum had definitively shifted. The era of unchecked, highly profitable expansion was over. Radio steel and manufacturing was now engaged in a grim, defensive war of attrition against its own heavy industrial legacy, merely trying to survive the crushing weight of its own history. The defensive war of attrition that defined the 1970s left the Grand Avenue facility vulnerable to an entirely different kind of disruption. The corporate leadership had spent a decade fighting internal battles, combating metallurgical fatigue, negotiating with militant labor unions, and absorbing the volatile shocks of the domestic steel market. However, the fatal blow to the Chicago assembly line did not originate from within the heavy manufacturing sector. It arrived in the 1980s in the form of a chemical polymer, high-density polyethylene. The introduction of specialized plastics into the American toy market fundamentally rewrote The rules of production. A new competitor, Little Tikes, pioneered the use of rotational molding, a process that stood in absolute contrast to the violent, concussive reality of steel stamping. This new methodology did not require 400-ton presses, deep concrete seismic foundations, or armies of specialized mechanics. It utilized hollow molds, heated plastic resin, and centrifugal force to create large seamless shapes. The resulting product was a profound paradigm shift. Plastic wagons were incredibly lightweight, inherently immune to rust, and naturally possessed soft, rounded edges. More importantly, the economics of rotational molding were devastating to traditional steel manufacturers. The raw material, plastic pellets, was a fraction of the cost of cold-rolled steel coils. The production process entirely eliminated the need for toxic enamel baths and massive, energy-intensive curing ovens. This material evolution triggered a rapid psychological shift in the consumer base. For half a century, the weight and rigidity of the steel radio flyer had been marketed as a testament to its durability and value. Suddenly, viewed through the lens of modern parenting standards, those same attributes were reclassified as liabilities. The sharp metal corners, the heavy steel undercarriages, and the tendency of the paint to chip and expose rusting iron to a child's hands were now perceived as dangerous. The market began to overwhelmingly favor the brightly colored, indestructible, and unthreatening plastic alternatives. Inside the Grand Avenue plant, the infrastructure was incapable of adapting. The entire facility, from its reinforced floors to its overhead conveyor systems, was engineered specifically to manipulate heavy metal. A steel stamping plant cannot be casually retrofitted to pour plastic. Radio Flyer was bolted to its legacy. The company attempted to counter the plastic invasion by leaning into its heritage, leaning heavily on the nostalgia of the classic red wagon. But nostalgia is an insufficient defense against a mathematically superior manufacturing model. As the 1990s progressed, the vice tightened. The American industrial landscape was undergoing a massive structural realignment driven by globalization. The barriers to international trade were falling, and maritime logistics had become incredibly efficient. Competitors were no longer just building cheaper plastic factories in the American Midwest. They were outsourcing their entire production lines to special economic zones in Asia, where labor costs were a negligible fraction of those negotiated by Chicago trade unions. For Radio Flyer, the mathematics of survival became stark and unforgiving. The cost to purchase domestic steel, power the aging presses, maintain the decaying Grand Avenue facility, and pay the pension and health care obligations of a unionized American workforce resulted in a unit cost that the retail market simply refused to bear. The company was hemorrhaging capital. The heavy industrial model, once the engine of their absolute dominance, was now actively pulling the corporation toward bankruptcy. The climactic moment in the company's history was not a dramatic failure on the factory floor, but a cold, calculated ledger calculation in the boardroom. To save the brand, the physical mechanism of its creation had to be amputated. The executive mandate was finalized. Domestic heavy manufacturing was economically unsustainable. In 2004, the execution of this mandate brought an abrupt, devastating end to an 80-year era. The order was given to halt production. The shutdown of the Grand Avenue assembly line was a visceral, traumatic event for the surrounding community of Belmont-Cragen. The defining characteristic of the neighborhood, the rhythmic, concussive pulse of the stamping presses that had vibrated through the soil since 1930, simply stopped. The sudden silence that descended upon the vast factory floor was heavier and more unnatural than the deafening noise that had preceded it. The human toll of this corporate survival strategy was immediate and absolute. The secondary narrative of the factory concluded in the parking lot as hundreds of highly skilled generational workers, mechanics, welders, painters, and press operators were handed their final severance packages. The localized economy that had synchronized its heartbeat to the factory whistle for 3/4 of a century was abruptly severed from its lifeblood. Fathers who had expected to pass their union cards to their sons instead found their specialized industrial skills entirely obsolete in the new service-based economy of 21st century Chicago. Inside the facility, the dismantling of the empire commenced. The massive steel dies, the heavy machinery, and the overhead conveyors were unbolted and stripped from the floors. Equipment that was too heavy or too specialized to be sold on the secondary market was brutally cut apart with acetylene torches and sold for scrap metal. The deep concrete foundations, poured to withstand decades of industrial violence, now supported empty air. The life cycle of the classic red wagon was fundamentally severed from the American working class. The supply chain was redirected across the Pacific Ocean. The company transitioned 100% of its manufacturing to specialized low-cost factories in China. The raw materials, the labor, and the environmental toll of production were successfully outsourced to a different hemisphere. The wagons that arrived at American ports months later still bore the iconic Radio Flyer logo, but their origin had been scrubbed clean of the Chicago soot and the deafening roar of the Grand Avenue presses. The corporation had successfully executed a flawless pivot, transforming itself from a heavy industrial manufacturer into a lean, modern entity focused entirely on product design, brand management, and global logistics. They had survived the extinction event that claimed so many American industrial giants, but the cost of that survival was absolute. The steel heart of the enterprise was dead. When an American heavy manufacturing empire collapses, it typically leaves behind a highly visible, monumental corpse. The narrative of deindustrialization is almost exclusively defined by the grim aesthetics of the Rust Belt: shattered grid windows, collapsing brick facades, flooded basements, and sprawling, weed-choked parking lots. Cities like Detroit, Gary, and Cleveland are littered with these decaying cathedrals of labor. The Radio Flyer facility on West Grand Avenue, however, presents a profoundly different architecture of loss. There is no crumbling masonry. There are no rusted gates swinging in the Chicago wind. The destruction of this particular industrial powerhouse was entirely internal, calculated, and clinical. It is an invisible ruin. It is a site where the physical shell of the building was meticulously preserved, while the industrial soul was systematically and permanently extracted. Following the executive mandate in 2004, the corporate directive was not merely to halt production, but to enact a total physical and environmental remediation of the space. The sprawling factory floor, which had absorbed 3/4 of a century of mechanical violence, was subjected to a rigorous corporate cleansing. The first stage of this erasure targeted the heavy machinery. The massive 400-ton stamping presses, the undeniable mechanical heart of the operation that had dictated the rhythm of the surrounding neighborhood and stamped out over 100 million steel wagons, were unbolted from their deep seismic foundations. These presses were not preserved as museum artifacts or monuments to American industrial supremacy. They were treated as obsolete liabilities. Heavy rigging crews moved in, dismantling the 2-story-high cast iron structures with industrial cutting torches. The disassembled pieces of the Great Chicago Assembly Line were loaded onto flatbed trucks and sold into the global scrap metal market, destined to be melted down and repurposed, likely in the very overseas factories that had rendered them obsolete. The physical extraction of the machinery was followed by an intense chemical erasure. The vast concrete floors of the Grand Avenue plant were deeply saturated with decades of heavy machine oil, cutting fluids, and the persistent, sticky residue of commercial red enamel. To prepare the building for its new corporate life, this biological and chemical record of human labor had to be wiped clean. Industrial grinders and chemical solvents were deployed across the vast square footage, scraping away the dark, grease-stained patina of the 20th century to reveal the sterile, bare concrete beneath. The cavernous curing ovens, which had baked the paint onto millions of steel bodies in suffocating heat, were dismantled and hauled away. The overhead conveyor chains were cut from the steel rafters. The most profound absence, however, was not the machinery or the oil, but the silence. The deafening, concussive roar of the stamping department, a sound that had defined the atmospheric pressure of the building since 1930, was replaced by the low, regulated hum of modern climate control systems. This physical sanitization precipitated the final conclusion of the secondary narrative, the absolute locking out of the localized working class. The punch clocks were removed from the walls. The heavy steel lockers, once filled with denim work clothes and heavy boots, were liquidated. The complex symbiotic ecosystem of the Belmont-Cragen neighborhood evaporated. The diners and taverns across the street, which had synchronized their existence to the shift changes of the factory, lost their entire customer base and quietly boarded up their windows. The generations of immigrant laborers who had traded their hearing and their respiratory health for a steady wage were permanently severed from the site of their labor. The footprint of the blue-collar mechanic was effectively erased from the corporate history. In the years following the cessation of manufacturing, the empty shell of the Grand Avenue plant was meticulously repurposed. The corporation invested millions in transforming the former heavy industrial site into a modern, eco-friendly corporate headquarters. The architectural redesign embraced the sleek, frictionless aesthetic of the 21st century tech sector. The deep concrete foundations that once absorbed the localized earthquakes of the stamping presses now supported open-plan office layouts, glass-walled conference rooms, and ergonomic workstations. The corporate leadership aggressively pursued and achieved high-level environmental certifications for the renovated facility. The roof of the plant, which for decades had actively vented the toxic, volatile organic compounds of the enamel paint lines directly into the Chicago sky, was retrofitted with an expansive state-of-the-art solar canopy. The facility was rebranded as a beacon of sustainability and green design. However, this environmental triumph contained a dark, unspoken irony. The Grand Avenue headquarters was only able to achieve its pristine, eco-friendly status because the company had successfully exported the severe environmental toll of its heavy manufacturing to the industrial zones of China. The pollution had not been eliminated. It had simply been relocated to a different hemisphere, far from the view of the American consumer. The demographic profile of the building's inhabitants underwent a total inversion to match the new architecture. The thousands of unionized laborers were replaced by a fraction of that number in highly educated, white-collar professionals. Software developers, digital marketers, supply chain analysts, and industrial designers now occupied the exact geographic coordinates where mechanics had once wrestled with raw steel. These new employees walked across the sanitized, polished floors, completely isolated from the brutal physical history of the space they inhabited. The facility was no longer a factory. It was an innovation center, a sterile environment optimized entirely for brand management and intellectual property control, rather than the physical creation of goods. This seamless transformation represents the climactic paradox of the radio flyer narrative. In strictly economic terms, the company executed a flawless, highly successful strategy. By amputating its domestic manufacturing arm and outsourcing 100% of its production, the corporation avoided the financial ruin that consumed countless other legacy American brands. It adapted to the unforgiving, mathematically ruthless realities of the globalized economy. Profit margins stabilized, and the corporate entity continued to thrive, expanding its catalog to include plastic ride-on toys, folding wagons, and lithium-ion-powered vehicles. Yet, to achieve this survival, the company had to commit a form of industrial suicide. It had to self-terminate the very soul that had defined it. The enterprise that Antonio Passin built, an empire defined by the physical manipulation of raw materials, the grueling endurance of the immigrant working class, and the sheer deafening power of the Chicago steel industry, technically ceased to exist in 2004. The modern corporate entity is merely a highly profitable ghost inhabiting the architectural shell of its predecessor. the little red wagon remains a ubiquitous fixture of the American childhood. Millions of units are still sold worldwide, and the Radio Flyer logo retains its immense cultural and psychological equity. But the physical object itself has been entirely severed from its origins. It no longer carries the weight, the sweat, or the metallurgical strength of the American Midwest. It is no longer forged in the intense heat of the stamping floor, or painted by the hands of a localized, generational workforce. The modern wagon is an imported commodity, a product of international maritime logistics rather than domestic labor. The epic narrative of American steel toy manufacturing did not end in a spectacular, fiery collapse. It ended in a quiet, highly profitable, and thoroughly sanitized corporate pivot. The glory of that heavy industrial era is permanently relegated to the past, a rusted legacy meticulously swept away, yielding entirely to the frictionless, invisible mechanisms of the global supply chain. The story of the Grand Avenue plant is just one chapter in the vast, often forgotten narrative of American industry. The empires of the 20th century built our modern world, but their foundations are quietly crumbling beneath the weight of globalization and time. If you appreciate these deep dives into the rise, the dark side, and the ultimate fall of our industrial giants, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support is the engine that allows us to continue unearthing these histories. We want to hear from you. Did you grow up with a cold-rolled steel radio flyer? Or do you remember when the shift to plastic began? Let us know your thoughts and memories in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep looking past the modern facades and remember the history hidden in the rust.